When a man has done what he considers his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. Those were the words of former South African President Nelson Mandela, who passed away just last week. Good evening and welcome to another episode of Vantage Point on a week that is being declared as a week of mourning in South Africa, and the tributes flowing in from across the world, even from Sri Lanka, for this great leader. Tonight on the show we have a lot to speak about. The life of Nelson Mandela, our tributes to him, and also about the political situation in Sri Lanka. As usual, I have with me our guest this evening, Dr. Dayan, Jayatilleka, former diplomat and political analyst. Very good evening, sir. Welcome to the show.
Good evening, Mahina.
I started off with a quote of Nelson Mandela because I felt it was apt to pay tribute to this great leader. You know, tributes started pouring in when Jacob Zuma made the announcement that he had passed away and that he was at peace from US, from Britain, from India, from China, from across the world, Doctor. And, you know, even in the US we saw how the flag at the White House was at half-mast, and basically when our president gave his tributes to Nelson Mandela. When you think of Nelson Mandela, Doctor, what comes into mind?
A moral leader, a leader who has such universal acclaim as we have not seen in our lifetime. When and where does the White House lower its mast, its flag to half-mast when a non-American dies? And it's not just the White House. From global north to global south and back, from the ideological right to the ideological left, there is universal acclaim for this one man, Nelson Mandela. When have we last seen that happen? This is a man whose patriotism was on par with his universality. He was not a narrow nationalist, a narrow patriot. He was a patriot, but an African patriot, as he said in 1964 at his trial. But he is a man who's recognized as a great humanist, a great humanitarian, a great human being. Now that's not usually the case. People are usually compartmentalized. They either belong to a country or to a region or to a particular ideological or philosophical paradigm. But Mandela transcended all that. He transcended cultures, civilizations, geographic regions, economic systems, ideologies. This is rare, and in our lifetime, I might even say unique. So I ask myself why. And the single factor that I come up with is that he has been recognized as a leader who had great moral and ethical virtues. Now, in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, morality is seen as something private and almost a sort of conservative or narrow notion of virtue. But we are not talking about private life. Mr. Mandela, because of the kind of life he led, he had a very stormy private life in a certain sense until he married Gracia Machel at the age of 80.
Yeah.
But we are talking about morality in its universally recognized sense. We are talking about ethics. This is a man whose moral and ethical values and virtue have been recognized by the world. And that is the secret of the almost saint-like stature that he has achieved. Though, unlike Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela did have a place for violent resistance as well in the cause that he fought for.
And I think opposition leader of our country pointed at that out in Parliament when tributes were made to Nelson Mandela. He said Nelson Mandela was no Gandhi, but he adopted the ideals of the Gandhian ideals after he achieved his objective. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think he went beyond. He was more successful than Gandhi. So I think in a way the leader of the opposition was slightly mistaken, because the Mahatma tried to prevent the division between the Hindus and the Muslims. He tried to prevent the violence that accompanied the partition, but he was unable to, despite the fact that he was on a hunger fast. But Mandela, probably having learnt those lessons, he was more successful than Mahatma Gandhi and prevented any kind of violence between the blacks and the whites, between the majority and the minority, between those who had finally assumed their rightful place and those who were leaving the stage of history.
But do you believe that Nelson Mandela, when you speak about majority and minority, his sense of majority and minority was quite different to how we would see majority and minority?
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, this is one of the reasons for his success. Mandela's notion of majority was rather like the notion of Jawaharlal Nehru. Few people know that Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, derives its title from a famous phrase of Jawaharlal Nehru, where Nehru said there is no easy walk to freedom. He was talking about the marches that Mahatma Gandhi and he undertook in their campaign of non-violent resistance against British imperialism. Now, both Nehru and Mandela defined nationhood, defined majority in terms rather different from most parts of the world, whether it was neighboring Zimbabwe in the case of South Africa or Sri Lanka as it came to be in 1972. Now, in Zimbabwe, as in Sri Lanka, majority has become defined in terms of one marker or cluster of markers. Ethnicity. I mean, if you're Sinhalese, you belong to the majority. If you're Sinhala Buddhist, you are even more part of the majority. And then there's caste. But for Nehru, majority meant all Indians, including Muslims. For Mandela, the majority meant the democratic majority, the majority of people. Blacks, those of Indian origin, and whites, the progressive whites. The best evidence is that the African National Congress developed a military wing which was founded by Nelson Mandela, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. And Mandela was arrested because of his pioneering activity in founding this armed resistance wing. Now, who took over Umkhonto we Sizwe with the blessings of Mandela, and who was his lifelong comrade, colleague and friend? Joe Slovo. Joe Slovo was a white, Jewish, communist lawyer, Mandela was a lawyer as well, who headed up the military wing, in other words the army of the ANC. And that was the kind of multiracialism, multiculturalism that Mandela's patriotism encompassed. He did not respond to white racism by invoking black racism, whereas in Sri Lanka it's either Tamil racism or Sinhala racism, and they feed on each other. It's either Tamil minoritarianism or Sinhala majoritarianism. Now, for Mandela there was no such thing. The enemy was the white establishment, not the white community. And the majority was not only the black people, but the people of Indian origin and the white progressive people as well. And this is what he thought at the very beginning of his struggle. It is what enabled him to negotiate a peaceful transition and to preside over a society which had healed its wounds. If he had been like Mugabe, or if he had been like some of our Sri Lankan leaders and just focused on his community, his skin color, where he was coming from, his province, for instance, then South Africa would have been divided, really.
It wouldn't be the rainbow nation it is today.
It wouldn't. It would have been a stormy nation. There would have been permanent civil strife. At the very least, there would have been a permanent alienation.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, do you endorse armed struggle in order to achieve one's objective? Should there be at least a slight element of it? Is it impossible to achieve one's objectives, or basically bring in democracy to a country without armed struggle?
Well, it depends on the kind of enemy that you have to fight. Now, Mahatma Gandhi was able to use non-violent resistance because he was fighting British colonialism. And it was possible, though one had to be ready for sacrifice, to prevail using non-violent methods. But imagine trying to use non-violent methods against Hitler and fascism. It is just not possible. So, one must know when to use violence. It has always to be a last resort, not a first resort. And it has to be used in a manner that it never consciously targets the innocent. Now, Mandela and the ANC and its military wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, had a policy that it would not target civilians. There have been incidents of civilians being targeted, settlers being targeted by individual guerrilla fighters of the ANC, but they had to come before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and confess their crimes. But as a policy, there was no targeting of civilians. Now, Che Guevara, who Mandela said he had studied before he started the resistance campaign, said very clearly in his book on guerrilla war that so long as a government has come into office through electoral means, even if those electoral means may involve some element of fraud, you must not try to wage armed struggle. But if it is a dictatorship, then of course armed struggle is justified. So, for instance, the armed struggle of the Tigers, certainly after the government of Sri Lanka went in for negotiations from 86, was unjustified because there were other ways of doing it. On the other hand, the war that the Sri Lankan state waged against the Tigers was justifiable because the Tigers were not engaging in parliamentary politics and they were not willing to sincerely negotiate. But it doesn't mean that anything and everything goes when you wage a guerrilla war. And Mandela was very clear about this, that the guerrilla resistance had to maintain certain ethical and moral criteria. It could not sink to the level of the enemy. The white establishment set dogs on black people. The most hideous type of humiliation and cruelty was perpetrated. Even his wife was humiliated, Winnie Mandela. But Mandela never sanctioned and never allowed the reciprocal cruelty of targeting civilians or even treating the white establishment, once it had lost, as an occupied, defeated enemy. So Mandela transcended those passions, though he was passionate in his patriotism, passionate in his struggle against oppression, principled in his unflinching resistance, but he transcended those. He never allowed it to become hatred. He hated the system, not the individual.